Okay, welcome. Welcome to the Language Matters in the Pacific seminar series organized by the Linguistics Department of SPACE, USP, School of Pacific Arts, Communications and Education. And this is the first seminar for this year, as Dr. George asked us in the earlier. So we started with this seminar last year, where we thought that a lot of discussions, very important discussions, which touches the lives of every Pacific Islander, the people from the region, is happening all over the world. And because we teach linguistics and because we are a regional university, we thought, let's see how much our language is part of this discussion, is part of this space. And we decided to choose various topics like communication and other things last year. And this year, we start the session with this topic, the language challenge in global climate framework. And just to let you know, our next session will be on 21st May, and that will be on language matters in environmental conservation. Why I'm saying that now? Because most of you who are here today would also be part of that, as it's very much interrelated. And I must give my sincere thanks to Dr. Tolu Muli Ina for joining us. He is a lecturer in climate change in Center for Sustainable Futures in PACE. And we are very thankful to you, who has agreed to be our host. And of course, a very big welcome and thanks to our panelists today. And now I'm inviting Dr. Tolu to take us through the session. Just a tiny request to all our participants, apart from the panelists, please, the others, it will be really nice if you can keep yourself muted. Vinaka. Thanks, Dr. Tolu. Over to you.
Many thanks, Rajan, for that, for setting the scene and also welcoming our session, as well as our participants joining us from around the region. And obviously it's a pleasure to be invited to be part of this webinar series, which is a great start for this year. By way of introduction, if I can say very, very briefly about myself, and then I will introduce the 5 panelists in a minute. You heard Rajan mentioning my name a few seconds ago, and I work here at the Center for Sustainable Future, previously known as Pacific Center for Environment and Sustainable Development. We've just started in terms of working together with other sections that are now forming the new Center for Sustainable Futures. For our purposes today, if I may introduce our panelists for sake of everybody who's joining us today. We have, as you would have seen in the flyer, we are very pleased to have 5 panelists who will be sharing with us their views on the language challenge in global climate frameworks, conversation we're going to have in a minute. First of all, we have 5 of them. Our first panelist is Coral Basisi. She's the Director of Climate Change and Sustainability at the Secretariat Pacific Community. Our second panelist, Fionga Salah, Dr. George Carter, is the Deputy Head of Department of Pacific Affairs and Director of Pacific Institute at the Australian National University. Our third panelist, Ms. Patricia Malam, Knowledge Broker at the Intra-ACP CLIMSA. I will not go into detail about that. In a minute, I will ask each one of them to introduce themselves and then talk about the work they can do in their own, in the different workplaces. Our fourth panelist, Mr. Siosiwa Veikune, representative from the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change. And our fifth panelist, Dr. Sina Bird of the Center for Sustainable Futures at USP. Now, kind of like to set the context to what we're going to talk about. Perhaps it's sufficient to make a statement now that our session, as I see it, there are two parts to it, two segments to it. So that the first part will be the introduction of the panelists, where we see this introduction as a way to set the context for the second part of our discussion, where we'll talk about panelist interaction with language in a different workspaces. So our focus for our discussion today is on climate policy conversation. You know, as we know that all of this climate policy conversation takes place at different levels and also at different spaces. So in the next few minutes or so, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce a different policy space, and kind of give us an idea of what actually happens in these policy spaces, and perhaps tell us the nature of their own involvement in that space. So perhaps, since Carol's not here, perhaps if I can start with George. If you could you please give us an overview of what happens at global climate change conferences like the COP29, for example, that we had last year, and how has it been your own personal participation in these conferences? So that's sort of like what I want, George, if you want to talk about global climate change, specifically with COP conferences, and what sort of like your involvement in this? I know you're involved a lot in this space. Perhaps you can give us a flavor of what actually happens. George, please.
Yeah, malo so formal lang yung fa talo firm fa tulo wat pa yemal malu faina putumai Maori and Talofa. I'd like to start with my languages. So I am from Samoa. My name is George Carter, and as Tolu introduced, I'm also a chief or high chief from the village of Leauwa'a, which is Salah. I am also a very proud Tuvaluan from the islands of Nanumea in the northern part of Tuvalu. I have family and heritage from Nanumea, and also from my family in Tarawa in Kiribati. I'm a part of Kiribati, and so Maori to not only my family and friends, but also those from Kiribati, from the controversial place of Wondiki, and that's where my family originates from. But I grew up and my education is all in Samoa, except times where I undertook university undergraduate in Wellington, New Zealand, and then with the master's, PhD, and now as of consequence, continued on in the faculty lecturing in Canberra at the Australian National University. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to acknowledge the School of Linguistics, but also PACE, Rajan and Taitolu, and as well as my good friend Mila for this kind invitation. It's an honor to share insights on the type of work that I have been privileged to engage in terms of not only research, teaching, but a bit of what I call research brokerage in the area of international politics of climate change. And then within this piece of work, I explore the participation, the strategy, but also the agency of Pacific Island states in terms of their leaders and officials, but also people. And I speak here in terms of not only communities, but individuals. So I look and I also engage with these colleagues in terms of how they are effective in international negotiations and regional negotiations. So Unfortunately, I'm not as someone who engages on research at the community level. I mainly explore uh, areas where there is regional strategy and international strategy by Pacific people in the area of climate change. And that is a fascinating and important piece of work. And I utilize my Pacific methodologies in incorporating Talanoa into what I call global political ethnography. I explore the participation and interpret what Pacific peoples and Pacific states and the agency they bring at the international space, and also how they inform and influence that decision making at the international level, at the regional level. And by doing this, I engage with them. I work with negotiators. I advise leaders, ministers, regional organizations, um, people who come from within ministries of natural resources and environment, civil society, churches, those who come to COP and those who come to Pacific Island Forum or those who come to SPRIP meetings. I engage with those people. Those people are working in a regional and international level. I work in terms of trying to unpack with them, like bringing firsthand research advice on the spot. I try to work with them to manage the complexity of the type of work that they're engaged in. I try, by using language, I try to um, inform them. This is what the research saying. These are case studies. These are the storytelling that we've had in the Pacific. And then we work with them to write these briefs, and we work with them to engage in these negotiations. Huh? So it's kind of like an academic research policy on the go. And that's why those who know me, I'm always in different meetings, in different regional spaces, because it's a part of that work and research. The university sees it as a very important part of how research can engage with policy making firsthand and at the crux, and that you have ministers, you have officials tapping on the shoulder of academics and say, help me. That's this type of work. Some say you're like a roving ambassador for academia, academics who are on the go in these regional spaces. And so through those spaces, we enter into not only understanding their rituals, we learn the languages that our officials are engaged in, but then we come back to our classrooms and teach them to our students so that our next students who are going to in these spaces understand and know what the language and the latest jargon. We then try and unpack them in theory. So one of these sort of theories I look at international relations is to say, these are the theories of consensus decision making. This is how consensus is made within Pacific Island Forum. This is how consensus is made at multilateralism. This is how Pacific can influence US decision making on climate change. This is how Pacific can achieve a platform like having a COP. So we then come up with engaging policies such as supporting Pacific Island country campaigns to Conference of the Parties. We're behind the scenes in providing that research advice, strategic advice, but we also engage in these negotiations, coordinating positions. So I support the group from the Pacific who engage in negotiations for gender, but also the negotiations for indigenous people and local community platform. This is the unique opportunities where academics, students, like I take a group of students every year to COP, and this is something that I learned from USP. PACE used to have a program like this, and we now engage with this in ANU, but we only take Pacific Island students and First Nations Aboriginal Torres Strait Island students. That's our commitment in terms of in making sure that our students are not only exposed, engaged, but they also see a pathway in these opportunities. And part of that is also being exposed to the language. So as I've said, we're not only engaged firsthand in the meetings throughout the year, at the COP at the end of the year, Then we take these networks that we engaged in, and then we create research partnerships throughout the year. We take these learnings in our teaching, and we also take these learnings into our research. Our research has now been used in other forums, so that in the area of oceans, they've engaged in our findings and our writing in the area of land. And the new area that we are now engaged in terms of keeping this momentum of being engaged at international politics level, is space, in the aerospace sector. So that's our new engagement. Just as how we have been prominent in our diplomacy, in our stewardship of protecting the ocean and land and climate, the new area that we are now engaged in is aerospace. How can we bring the language of not only traditional stewardship, climate stewardship, into the area of protecting the climate, how man is now engaged in space frontier. And this is where we've been approached by NGOs International and other countries. George, bring the lessons of climate and ocean diplomacy into the space of space diplomacy. How can we make sure humankind are kind to the youth? And I would say that is part of, and I see my friend Ariella, we've had a long engagement in terms of this kind of conversation of how do we bring Pacific language, Pacific values, Pacific systems, and also protecting the use and the management of the aerospace sector. And I'll leave it there as a sort of first introduction to the panel.
Thanks. Thanks, George, for that. That's quite a lot. We will get back to you on that. But can I get to Sosio to talk a little bit about the Pacific Island students fighting climate change? Sosio, I know that the Pacific Island students fighting climate change have been very, very active in this space, and especially in the COP. Can you, for the benefit of our audience, those who have never heard of Pacific Island students fighting climate change, can you tell us how did it start, and the nature of your involvement in this very global and very important campaign? Sosio, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Muriaina, and of course to the facilitators of today's program. Thank you very much for the invitation, consideration of Pacific Island students fighting climate change. Forever grateful for USP support and inclusion of the organization. And of course to the fellow panelists. We're extremely privileged, I would say, to be seated alongside such a very intimidating individuals, but I will nonetheless try to deliver. Yes, just a brief introduction for Pacific Island students fighting climate change. This is a youth-led organization that began in 2019 in the Amalus campus in Vanuatu, as well as Laudala. Made of 27 students with the goal, I will generalize and speed things up here for time's sake, but the goal of this organization and its establishment was to take the world's biggest problem to the world's highest court, taking climate change to the International Court of Justice. And I will not do justice to the story as well as Dr. Muriaina would, as he's also one of the founding members of the organization. But yes, the Pacific Island students fighting climate change's main goal for the last 5 years, or since 2019, has been to take climate change to the International Court of Justice. And that was a task that we thankfully put to rest last year in December, following the oral hearings before the International Court of Justice. And just for some context, the International Court of Justice and its rules and procedures and practice is very state-focused, very international org-focused. So when in 2019, Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate, PISFCC, when it began, there was an understanding that at some point, the campaigning or the lobbying for support would have to go beyond the grassroots movements because we needed the support of states. And in 2019 to 2020, the campaigning largely revolved around finding a support from a willing state that would take on this campaign, would shoulder this campaign. And we found that in the government of Vanuatu, who has a great track record of championing these climate initiatives in the Pacific. That's alongside Ecocide and pushing for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. They also shouldered the championing of taking climate change to the International Court of Justice. So in securing the support of Vanuatu, I think something noteworthy was the collaboration that came out of that, which was Vanuatu essentially taking on PISFCC under its wing as the civil society front of the campaign, because there was an understanding there that such a global campaign around the issue of climate change meant that all sectors of these systems of government, of systems of states would need to be included, which is inclusive of the civil society arm. So taking on PSFCC to shoulder the civil society front of the campaign was a no-brainer. The lobbying strategy from there then would be Vanuatu alongside several other Pacific states who soon became champions in their own right of the cause, would lobby states around the world, and Pacific Island students fighting climate change alongside several other civil society from the Pacific would bring together the civil society around the world, and together there would be a great push or a pressure amongst in different sectors to ensure that the first leg of the race, which was to get endorsements for this campaign, would be very successful. And in that lobbying, we found a very interesting, or several interesting conclusions with regards to today's topic of the language matters. But before I do go into any detail there, Dr. Muyaina mentioned earlier about our participation in COP. And for those of you that aren't too familiar with the COP processes, or at least civil society's participation in COP, it's essentially, it's become a very different thing from what it was when COP began 30 odd years ago, which is this COP, Conference of the Parties. For states, or at least it's a very state-focused process. And the inclusion of civil society seemingly invites a sort of trouble, not in a bad way, but it's that they are not in their element in these spaces, and they're there to bring pressure from civil society, because more often than not, civil society has the more ambitious demands that states aren't willing to make public. And civil society, such as PSFCC and other orgs, are there to keep their states in check, or to ensure that their messaging and that their intentions are of the most ambitious. And ergo, our participation in COP since 2019 was to, of course, up the pressure of the most ambitious asks from civil society, but also to lobby support from other civil society that we hadn't yet reached, as well as supporting the Vanuatu government in lobbying states as well. Because more often than not, we found that states aren't willing to listen to anyone else but their own being their youth, their civil society. And COP is seemingly a place where you can catch all of these persons of interest. You can catch civil society from the farthest regions from the Pacific. You can catch government officials that don't usually make themselves public. You will find them at COP. And it's also just the realization that COP should be identified for what it is, which is a checkpoint and not necessarily a goal to be reached. It's where you, for civil society. And more often than not, that's what it should be treated as. And that's where we found ourselves, and that's why we found ourselves in that space. It was a great ground for lobbying states and finding support from civil society. And I believe much of our capacity building, much of our training was done on the ground in the COP spaces. It was Egypt and Dubai and Glasgow. Those 3 COPs in a row really capacity built the Pacific Island Students Fund climate change members in terms of upping their game in diplomacy, upping their game in legal drafting. And it's not necessarily these very intentional modes of teaching. You sort of pick these up on the way. But all in all, to work towards the goal of lobbying and finding support for the campaign. I hesitate to go on any further into the more contents around language matters, Dr. Muliaina, unless you do wish for me to do so. But I will pause there for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Osio, for that. I think that's sufficient for now. We will go to the other panelists, because the second segment, then we're talking about some specifics that came up from your intervention. But thank you very much for setting the scene for us in terms of PIFCC's contribution to this space. Unsure whether Carol has joined us, but may I invite Patricia for her contribution. Just briefly talk about her work. I know that she's with looking at it from a regional body organization type lens. Her work at SPREP can make a significant contribution to our discussion this afternoon. Patricia, please.
Thank you, Dr. Tolu. Bulavinaka Alaba, bonjour and kalufalava. I am Patricia Malam. I have an Egyptian Arabic surname. However, my cultural upbringing is more maternal, and one that I relate to more on my mother's side, from the village of Nandaria in Rewa in Fiji. I'm currently based in Apia, Samoa, and I work as the knowledge broker for the European-funded Intra-African, Caribbean, and Pacific Climate Services and Related Applications Program. It's a mouthful, but CLIMSA is the acronym, as much as I hate acronyms. I am currently based within the Climate Science and Information Division here at SPREP. And pretty much, in a nutshell, my work is to support the meteorological services of the 14 Pacific Island countries. And in saying that, my work involves the simplification of climate science information, the distribution, and just helping with the comprehension and the use of climate information between the Met services and different sectors and the general public. I work mainly in the agriculture and disaster risk reduction fields. I am also a PhD student at the University of Newcastle, and I'm also the basis of my research is on understanding how people in the agriculture sector understand and use climate information in its simplest form. So in relation to the conversation that we're having now about, the COP spaces and how we're working in those spaces, in my former life, which seems like a lifetime ago, I was also heavily involved in the COP spaces, both as a government representative when I was seconded to Fiji when Fiji had the presidency of COP, and the introduction of the Talanoa methodology in the COP spaces. And I was also, I've also worked as a support person for climate activists and lobbyists going into the COP spaces, so coaching young people on how to use climate science and facts to lobby more strongly in those more official spaces. And the one thing that I've learned in my former life working in the COP spaces is that, COP is a good platform. And as Sio had just said, it's a good platform, but it's not the only one. It is a checkpoint, but it's not the end all for all of the conversations that we have around climate science, climate change, and all of that. So thank you, Dr. Tolu. I'll hand back over to you.
Thanks, Patricia, for that. Very short, very succinct, and to the point. And we will come back to you in our second segment when you will tell us a little bit more about your work in your other life with sign language. Yeah. May I invite Dr. Sina Bird again. Dr. Sina Bird will be talking to us about the intersection between language and her work at the local community. So this is a community-focused type lens that she's bringing. She just defended her PhD thesis a week or so ago, and she will tell us a little bit more about her work in Solomon Islands. Sina, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Thank you for this opportunity and the invite. Yes, so just a brief. So I work mostly on research and engagement with the local communities. And so I look more into understanding their perception on what climate change is and extreme events and what are their experience and their observations. And coming back to the topic about communication and language, that was also one of the barriers that I have faced. Because coming from an academic side or as a researcher, we may know what the terms are, and we may know the definitions, but translating these languages or the terms or the terminology into a community level, it can be very challenging, even for me as a researcher, because there are some languages that we, in our local dialects, it is so difficult to try and explain to them what we are trying to, what the research we are trying to carry on or take in their local context. So it became a barrier because sometimes we have to use different phrases, and then it can create like a long set of story. You go around and around just so that they can understand what we are trying to explain when it comes to languages. So this is one of the issues when it comes to language and communication. It can be very difficult. And so one of the things that I've also found out was that asking them about their responses, what they think should happen, because looking at the international level, it's so different. Coming down to the government level, it's different, and the community level is totally different. So there can be a gap when it comes to communication. So they were saying that one of the things that they would like is to ensure that the youths or the students, some of the curriculums, they do explain, or they have some explanations in the different terms, because if this doesn't happen, or there's no definitions that or something that they can actually understand, that it can be a problem to implement what is or the outcomes into the community levels. So that is just a brief on what I was looking at.
Thanks, Sina, for that. Perhaps can I check if it's Carol? I'm sure whether Carol is able to join us.
She hasn't been able to join us, so
Okay,
yeah.
great, thanks. Can I transition now to the second segment of our webinar this afternoon? This second segment will basically, we heard what the panelists have said, and I'm struggling here to catch everything that they've said, but I'm hoping that we will have an opportunity towards the end where we'll give the audience an opportunity to ask questions. But if I can start by posting some talking points here, by looking at this George talked about this high-level discourse, and really what it is, my reading of it is that it's intended to translate into actions, and we all familiar with the fact that this discourse that need to be translated into actions on the ground. And I wonder, what happens when we sort of like try to explain this conversation or these terminologies about international declarations and all that to our communities. George would like to, you talk quite a lot about that because you work in that space. In terms of translating that conversation, if you can give us an example of how it was done and in what way it was done that was very successful. You can perhaps talk about the recent one, the COP29 negotiations, and if there's any specific examples that you can highlight, the need for us to pay closer attention to the language in which we used to communicate those discourses at the community level. I'll start with George, and maybe any Patricia or Zizua or Sina can add on to that. George, please.
Thank you very much, Tom. So the work that we carry out every year under the Conference of the Parties sits under what's known as a UN treaty, known as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Just under 40 years ago, countries from around the world signed a treaty to say that we will work together to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions and find ways in terms to help the world or countries adapt to these to the impacts from these emissions, so these climate impacts. That's basically the goal of the convention. So what this is, what sits under the UN, is just one of many different international mechanisms to create cooperation amongst all 193 plus countries. And the goal here is to unpack and also find ways to address the problem of climate change. If we do not have this treaty, if we do not have this annual meeting, then it's up to countries to do what they want to do with their greenhouse gas emissions. It's up to countries to find their own ways of funding to clean up or adapt to climate change. However, this declaration, the annual the platform in which it brings all 193 countries. Now, I also want to say here, these annual meetings are no more or less than 60,000 people. So it is the biggest multilateral meeting that happens every year. And it's the only meeting outside of the UN General Assembly where you have all or most or majority of UN government leaders in one place in one time. So it's a very dangerous, high intense place because of the level of security. If something happens and all these leaders are there, yeah. Anyways, let's not talk about that. But it's the in our current generation, where I am alive at the moment, this is the best alternative forum that we have to discuss, to negotiate, and find mechanisms to address climate change. There are other mechanisms that have been discussed and floated, like having regional or having bilateral means. This is the most effective as part of where we are now in terms of our life. This is our mechanism. So language is very important. The skill of not only navigating, but also introducing, keeping particular language, because at this level, at the international level, you're there to make up words and not make up words. I mean, you're there to try and introduce your ideas through these words, but then it's up to individual countries to interpret them and how to implement them, because they do not give binding, they're just encouragement or contributions from countries. So you bring in the words or the language, and it's up to countries to interpret in the way that they have. And so you may, so that's why going through these negotiations line by line is a meticulous, but it's also the most effective way for countries to not only, in our case, ask for climate finance, make sure that we have mechanisms like loss and damage fund, or make sure that we ask for accessible special consideration for Pacific Island countries, or that we put in language such as ensuring that we are able to access this without any barriers, funding for any barriers. but it's also a mechanism for other countries to come in and water it down and saying, if you want special consideration, maybe in another 10 years, or if you want financing, maybe financing once everyone puts in at least 100 billion. So while you put in through your words the action, other countries may come and water it down. And that's why it's an essential skill. It's language is not only a tool for peace, but it's also a tool for mobilization of funds, but a tool of mobilization resources so that we have them at the local level to combat this. Of course, it also, as I say, in watering down, it is through language or particular words that it may be hard for us to have access to this information. Language and what's used, of course, it's in English, so that is very exclusive. It's only for English-speaking countries, and all negotiators, whether you're Chinese, Russian, or even Samoan, you have to learn English to be an effective negotiator and to be able to be effective. Although it's translated in the other 5 languages, you still have to make sure that you're effective as an English negotiator. And the negotiating text is in English and then translated afterwards. So that's another aspect of why how the system is also very exclusive. It's only for those who have come through. So our friends from the French, like New Caledonia, French Polynesia, feel left out. They're not able to participate properly, engage properly because of their language. But also us, we have our indigenous languages and we are not able to engage effectively, sort of like the words that we use to name our plants and animals, our traditional knowledge is left out. It cannot be left in there. So it is, and the aim of this game, of these negotiations, is to be ambiguous as possible. Although Pacific Island countries who are at front line of negotiations want clear, concise, precise text, that you see a consistent flow of financing to support these issues that we have in the Pacific because of climate change, you have other countries who come and try to be as ambiguous as possible. So that's another where we say our incapacity or not enough capacity for those of us who are not only lawyers, but what we call those who can climate speak, those who understand the jargons, who can write, but also introduce text at particular times of negotiations. We've written quite a lot of body of work in climate speak and how to be effective in these areas. But there's also words or languages that Pacific Island countries should feel proud that we have introduced, or particular rituals that we have introduced in COP negotiations. For example, when Fiji hosted, they introduced the Talanoa dialogue. Now, there is a very critical there's a critical discourse that says that it was not introduced in a culturally sensitive manner, and I stand with that conviction. But it has also introduced a particular words of when in the negotiations, when negotiators says we go to Talanoa, people know what that means. It's a next room, and it's unbridged conversations to try and form ways to merge negotiation texts. So that's something that is now part and parcel of international negotiations. Terms such as Moana. So the name of the pavilion that the Pacific has is Moana Pavilion. Unfortunately, we get that other tie-in with the cartoon, but it is very much, when we say Moana Pavilion, it's the Pacific, and it's now part of a lingo and an understanding by many negotiators. Moana Pacific, but we also have Moana Pavilion there. But even terms such as PSIDS, 10 years ago when I started this, that term wasn't known or understood, but through the commitment and resilience of Pacific countries negotiators, that is the name of the Pacific negotiating group that sits under the Alliance of Small Island States. And so now in that world, when people say PSIDS, They know specifically, it means specific. And then I'll end here and move on to the next. The importance of defining or not defining particular terms. So in the area of climate finance, it's something that's not defined within negotiations, mainly because countries do not want to define or limit what climate finance is. In the Pacific, we call climate finance as a responsibility, and this is a global south view. It's a responsibility of pollution countries. However, uh, countries from the north would rather say climate finance is money that's produced by governments, private sector, but also philanthropy. So they're trying to spread the compensation or spread those who contribute to this fund. That's what I mean. There's also strategy in defining or not defining definition. And now to conclude there, I'd also like to bring something that's very peculiar to me, but it's important. The word indigenous. Now, this is a word that throughout the Pacific, whether it be climate change or in other aspects of UN language, is something that we do not all share or see eye and eye on. Whether Pacific, is there such thing as Pacific indigenous? However, in these negotiations, we go in understanding, but also supporting indigenous means first peoples in the Pacific. We have parties that come to us and say, now, George, are Pacific people indigenous or not? Because you say that you navigated to these islands. So that means you're not from these islands. You're actually from somewhere else. So you're not indigenous. So they like to use these, and I said, no, Pacific people came from other places, but we're the first. So indigenous means the first peoples. So these are also some of the examples of not only the politics, but the wordsmithing that happens in these negotiations, but also the watering down of particular words, and then the essential why it's important for those who are engaged in negotiations to understand climate speak, the jargons and the strategy of when to introduce and not introduce these terms. And I'll hand over to the next speaker for their reflections. Thank you, Tony.
Thanks, George, for that contribution. I mean, it's always good to hear from the chiefs, eh? But can I invite the other panelists, your reflection on a very important conversation, and you heard George spoke about how to influence or how to make this high-level conversation speak to us in a language that speak to us in a way that we can participate in these spaces meaningfully, but also the fact that we need to communicate this conversation to our communities and for our communities. I wonder whether Pacific Island students fighting climate change, I know that you have made some inroads into that to that space, and what are some of your reflection or takeaway from those spaces, Sosiwa, if any?
Of course. I guess I must admit that we are not or we as civil society aren't fortunate enough to be as included or as I guess as included with the negotiating process in these multilateral spaces. Where we've managed to be tail ends to certain negotiators sometimes, and it's it's such an interesting task, a very draining task as well. I think George would attest to as well that these spaces can be, and I guess from the civil society perspective, there's always an understanding that, especially from the Pacific, I would think, that these systems, conventions, multilateral spaces that we attend as Pacific Islanders, there is, by nature, our presence will invite conflict. And that's because more often than not, these systems have been set up without the consideration of the Pacific or or without the proper consultation with certain global South communities. And so there's an underlying understanding that you will show up already at a disadvantage. Now that there are certain ways to address these disadvantages. It's taking an appropriate training, capacity building, but there also has to be that underlying understanding that you already are conflict. Your mere presence will bring that about you, and it's because you're essentially going against the grain here, in uphill battle, so to speak. And it's in these systems that we also do find that what's the word for it? It also becomes a perfect ground for really activating your diplomacy bone and truly finding out how much patience you can have with these systems. And it's taking into consideration what your demands are as civil society from the Pacific, what your demands are as youth, what your demands are as young people, and then essentially holding a mirror up to other states. So if I were to provide an example, I think from PSFCC at least, we've, as civil society, we've essentially worked in terms of messaging guides, the communications aspect of campaigning, an often overlooked aspect to these CSO, to these civil society campaigns. It's often overlooked, but it's a very powerful tool when used appropriately. And in terms of messaging guides, because we understood that this campaign, or that campaigning in general in these multilateral spaces requires you to have a very high level of diplomacy, whilst also knowing when to draw the line in terms of your demands. So the messaging guides would be tailored towards, let's say, states that would align with your priorities as Global South or as Pacific, and then you'd have a separate messaging for other states that don't necessarily share your views. And it was having these differing perspectives in these differing approaches in these multilateral spaces that allowed for not just us, but for civil society at large to navigate their way to essentially get the yes that they're looking for. And that's in terms of, you'd have a different messaging when you're speaking to other civil society, convincing them of your arguments of why these priorities of the Pacific should be shared across the board. And then you'd have a different set of messaging when you're addressing members of government, advocating for arguments in favor of their youth, in favor of their future generations, intergenerational equity. And I bring up this language in terms of language matters because at the end of the day, and I alluded to it earlier, in terms of governments often at times will only listen to their own. So the pressure that would come from the pressure that would be very effective to them, or the ones that they would only consider, are the ones coming from their own young people. So it's a matter of finding those priorities in which you align with the appropriate sector on their side, and then finding a strategy that allows you to move forward and to finding yourself to the appropriate party, which is in the instance of COP states. And I bring up the messaging guide as well because it's something that has to constantly be reassessed again and again. And that's because you also run the risk of inappropriately using the Pacific stories, I would say. It's because, unfortunately, in these COP spaces, you can't bring the entire Pacific there so that everyone can appropriately represent themselves. So you, as the present Pacific Islander, have the responsibility of doing justice to Pacific experiences in these spaces, whilst also being mindful that they aren't your stories. So you can't just speak about them as you wish, even just because you're Pacific Islander. There's a degree of respect that you have to have for these stories because they aren't just your own. They are the Pacific's, and it's that fine line of finding, in terms of your advocacy, it's finding what is appropriate to share, when is it appropriate to share it, and also how you share it. It's essentially the attempt to dictate every step of the way in terms of showcasing and highlighting specific stories. Sorry. And then, yes. And then in highlighting these specific stories is essentially the bedrock for a lot of civil society messaging, a lot of civil society advocacy, because that is the foundation for a lot of the advocacy. It's bringing specific stories, specific experiences, bringing that human lens, that human perspective to these often sterile environments, because often at times, and this is an observation made again and again by PSFCC, is that with these discussions of nationally determined contributions and strict climate sciences, operationalization of loss and damage funds and whatnot, there more often than not, the human element or the human experience is missing from these multilateral spaces, which at its core is what the Pacific's advocacy is about. So that is essentially the bedrock of civil society advocacy in COP spaces, in UNGA. It's bringing this human rights lens to these spaces and ensuring that they're appropriately shared. And that's done through very effective messaging that's constantly reassessed, just so that you're not overshooting your messaging, but also inappropriately showcasing Pacific experiences. Back to you, Dr. Mulena.
Okay. Thanks, Cecile, for that. I'm wondering, I mean, you mentioned, you and George mentioned quite a lot of things, but I'm just wondering for Patricia and Sina, given that they also work very closely with communities, I'm wondering in terms of the messaging that you mentioned, and how does that translate in terms of the use? You're talking about Pacific stories and how that is an important feature at these spaces. For Patricia and Sina, I wonder whether your work, and I know Patricia is working at Project on Sign Language, and how does that feature in terms of communicating these big messages coming from the global community to the local community? Patricia, please.
Thank you, Dr. Tolu. For a while, I got carried away listening there to Salah and Siosua. So I just wanted to kind of share a little bit more about the specific area of work which connects into the overall COP process. So like even in the UN climate change process, through the convention and the different bodies, it relies on scientific information on, climate change and what's going on. So some of the reports you might have heard about, like the IPCC reports, the state of the climate reports that are released by WMO and IPCC jointly. So the significance of the science language is very important as well in the COP process, as is the discourse that comes from the different members that go into this space. And the work that I'm doing currently is really the translation of science into different, let's say, bite-sized pieces for communities to be able to engage in. And climate science and variables are very important, because in order to understand climate change, you need to also understand what's going on in the climate around us to be able to talk about it. So things like rainfall, temperature, the hazards, what's really happening in the climate around us that requires us to then go into these global spaces to lobby for and say, hey, things are changing back home and this is what we're seeing. So in order for people like, average people like us to be able to do that, we really need to understand what the Met Service is telling us about what's going on with climate projections in our, in our seasonal changes, and also to at least understand the difference between weather patterns and climate, because they're two very different things. And in the meteorological space, more people tend to, like relate to weather because that's just, day-to-day things that happen. But climate is more longer timescales, like you're looking at 30 to 300 year timescales that can give you a good indication of have rainfall patterns changed, has temperature changed. So I just wanted to very quickly just bring to mind what the latest global state of the climate is telling us. So what we know already is that sea level rise and ocean warming is irreversible already for hundreds of years. So even if we did try to make some significant changes now, there's a lot that's already irreversible, and there is science to tell us this. What we also know is that record greenhouse gas concentrations combined with El Nino and other factors have driven us to a point of record heat levels, like in all of 2024. Although in the Pacific, we have seen these record numbers already, even before the globe has started experiencing it. But just coming closer to my very specific area of work, what we know from the global state of the climate reports is that early warnings and climate services are even more critical now than ever before because of these changes in the science. And some of the work that I've been doing is translating some of this science into service. So how do we do that? So firstly, in the English language, looking at your Met services in the region, and I encourage you to do this. Let's say if you live in Fiji, go to the Fiji Met services and have a look at their Facebook page. What sort of information are they putting out? How are they relaying information like, what to expect in the next tropical cyclone season? How many are you going to expect? 3 or 4? How many did you anticipate last year? How many did you actually receive? So your Met service is actually a hub of so much information that can give you insights into your national climate situation as well as forecast. The other thing that we're working on here at SPREP is not just simplification of science to services with the Met services, we're actually taking it a step further. So not just translating them into English tangible products that you can use. We've also gone so far as to translate common meteorological terms and hazards into sign language. So you would know that sign varies from country to country. So what signs you might use in America is not the same that you would use in Fiji. The same in Australia cannot be just directly transferable to another part of the world. So what we did last year was we worked with members of the disability community. We consulted with the Pacific Disability Forum, as well as we engaged a consultant to help us test and, trial the creation of an Oceania sign. So like a series of words of meteorological terms and hazards that were translated into signs. So I have a couple of videos, and perhaps later I will show them to you. So that's just one of them, because in order for us to respond to these global calls of, early warnings need to be inclusive, climate services need to reach every single person, it's not just about translating it simply from science to something that you and I can understand. It's about reaching out to people who don't speak English at all, or persons who are deaf. The other thing that we're doing currently is in Kiribati, we are translating common meteorological terms from English into e-Kiribati. I know that Fiji, a number of years ago, I think around 2012, developed a glossary of Itauke terms on climate change, and that was an activity sponsored by GIZ. If you'd like to, I think there's still some resources out there for us to be able to understand. And I wonder how many other countries have actually taken the initiative to translate these complex, not just scientific, but English terms that may or may not even have a translation in our own indigenous person's vernacular to understand. One of the more successful things we have seen is, so WMO has a series of booklets called the COPE series on how to respond to and prepare better for natural disasters. And what we've started doing here in the Pacific is translating it for each of the Pacific Island countries. So Tonga has been the first country to do that already in 2023. And through funding from the Weather Ready Pacific program, we are looking at doing that for every single Pacific Island country. So translating science into English and then into vernacular so that people can use this information to make decisions that will impact, their safety as well as their well-being. So I'll just pause there for a while because I understand that was quite a lot to take in terms of the translation of science to English, then to Pacific Island language in different forms. Thank you, Dr. Tolu.
Thanks, Patricia, for that. And the fact that you already raised about the need to translate those technical jargon in a language that's easily accessible to our community. And I think Sina has also mentioned something along that line, coming from her, with regards to her work. I wonder, Sina, whether you would like to add something to the conversation using your own work, working with communities, whether or not you found the same challenge, or whether you have a slightly different experience when it comes to translating or finding a word that's already there, but it doesn't always translate in, doesn't have an equivalent in the English language. Sina, please.
Thank you, Dr. Tolu. Yes, so for me, what I've experienced is like the similar things that is already mentioned by our three panelists. So, for example, trying to explain the word climate change to local communities, and there's no specific language that they use to describe the word language. So in order to help them understand what I'm trying to talk about, we use the word talatala, and it's just change. So it can be used as change in the weather or change in environment. So these are some things that can sometimes be misunderstood, and the concept can be different for local communities. So it was very challenging trying to put science into our local dialect, because that is one of the main things that I have faced, is trying to put that science into the language so that they can understand what is happening. So they know, or they have heard of the word, what is climate change and what is happening, but then I always have the question, so what will you do for us? And if this is happening, then what would be a good solution that you can help us in order to understand what would be the perfect solution or measures? And like one of our panelists has already mentioned, when something happens or when climate change, like we're already facing this and there's no turning back. So what can be done? And it sometimes can be a bit difficult to try and give them a justification of or what can be done, because they already knew what is happening. But then bring it into science and bring the traditional knowledge to science, it can sometimes be very hard. So one of the questions that I was asked is that, so for your research, how will this help in the policies? And I have mentioned that, okay, so for me as research, it's working with communities. And one of the things that I can bring to the table is that to make sure that their priorities or what they wanted is voiced. And bringing something into the government level is not an easy task. It goes through process, and there are also different actors that they play the role in how to implement different packages into the communities. And so, like what our panelists have already mentioned, kind of already explained what I have also experience with the local communities right at the community level. So yeah, thank you, Dr. Tolu.
Thanks, Sin. This is an open question to all the panelists. I'm just wondering because what I'm hearing, and you've spoken about this, the fact that we are simply translating things from the English language. Don't you think that perhaps we need to change that slightly because we are simply explaining somebody else's and using the English language, and we know the challenges associated with the use of the English language. Is there a way around it? The fact that we're simply translating somebody's terminology, and we're struggling with the use of terminology because, as we all know, that sometimes there are no equivalent. What are your thoughts? And this is an open question to George and Socio. You guys have been involved at that space, at the global space. You know what it's like. Do you think these things matter at that space? Do you think our little challenge with the language matter at that level? Coming down, going that way, or coming back from global to local? Is that something you would like to comment on?
Sure, I can start. I thank you, Tolu, for that question. I think it's a mixture of both, but I think it's there needs to be relatively more in terms of advancing Pacific interpretation, but also Pacific language in terms of the work that we bring in climate change. And the avenue that I've seen in terms of policy, but also in research and then policy, is something that Patricia alluded to, which is on traditional knowledge, especially in the area, well, in all areas of traditional knowledge, but especially in a project that's led by SPREP on COSPEC that brings forth Pacific terms or Pacific language terms for weather prediction. For example, the name of winds. Now, we tend to just translate weather reports as northwesterlies or southerlies, as you know, literally in our weather reports. However, we have indigenous names of these winds. For example, in Samoa, you have names of winds which are called lau or toelau or fiti. These are winds that are coming particular. So our communities are not familiar with northwesterly winds. They're more familiar with lau winds or fiti or the winds that and so what it does is when we are able to document accounts, the policymakers in terms of the mid-office announcements are then made using those indigenous terms. And so that's a current case study where we see our traditional, indigenous, and sometimes local. Now, local is when we have both indigenous and settler or our new immigrant communities, especially in our cities, in our towns. Now, that's the cosmopolitan towns, that's where we use local language, right? The jargons that we use. And so those are some current projects, research, but also policies where we see an attention to not only indigenous names, but also the way that we use translation in climate change. Now, when I've carried out sort of consultation with local communities, for example, in Tonga last year, and then also in Badu and Saibu in Torres Strait Island last year. When I talk about climate change and ask about questions, there's no indigenous term. There's no such term that says climate change. But the way in which we explain it is in terms of the phenomena, in terms like what has happened, what have you seen changed in community 30 years ago till now? You know, and how has the weather changed? So although there's no one term, we explain it in a scenario. And that's what climate change work is also about. It's about the terms, ideas that look at scenarios 30 years ago and 30 years future, because that's what climate change action work tends to be about. And that my computer just shut down, but that's it's me, George, coming on the phone. But those are some ideas to share for the panel for now. Over to you, Tolu. Thank you.
Thanks, George, for that. I mean, I'm just wondering if there's any of the panelists would like to add to what George has said. But really, it's an open question, and I'm just wondering whether you see that as an opportunity, a challenge, or an opportunity where we can navigate in terms of not just translating, but also thinking about whether we need to move the post a little bit because we're simply translating somebody else's ideas for us.
Thank you, Dr. Tolu. I will add on just a little bit on in terms of my thoughts around it. And I know that in the space of science, you know, like in the space of any science, really, a lot of it is very skewed towards the Western world, because a lot of science seems to have been documented to have originated, you know. So when we talk about like even biodiversity and conservation, the scientific names that we give to plants and you know, like flora, fauna, and everything, really, it's very Western in the sense that it's Latin, it's English, and I could go on and on about this because it's even been inspiration for some of my own personal prose, where I'm just so against this sort of, you know, this culture of coming in and naming something, giving it a very Western name without understanding that it might have already had, you know, like a local name. People would have already been referring to something even before it was explored, discovered, and, you know, registered in some kind of database. So just going back to that, while I acknowledge that science is science, over the few years that I've been working in traditional ecological knowledge as well, being one of Randy's students way back in, I think, 2 centuries ago, one of the things I have learned is that over time, there seems to be more appreciation for traditional knowledge. And while there have been certain opinions, you know, stating that, oh, it's not really valid, it's not really science, there is now proof that this traditional knowledge is in fact science. And if you give a little bit more, you know, like time and space to Pacific Islanders to walk you through that journey, you will really see that there is a huge, a very strong link between the traditional science and indicators that we are now documenting more heavily than before, and understanding, and its relation to what we would understand as, let's say, the science that we have been taught to know. And as Salah George mentioned, there is a program here at SPREP under the Climate and Ocean Support Program, which looks specifically at traditional knowledge and indicators in the climate science space. I will share a link to that if anyone is interested in understanding a little bit more about what we're doing there. But in saying that, yes, I strongly agree that we need to be able to have a say in how things are framed for us, especially if we're talking about survival. You know, like the language of survival can be diplomatic, but it also needs to be something that we should all be able to understand. And if we understand it in vernacular, then it should be as such. I don't think we should limit ourselves to just going with the flow, because we know that only dead fish go with the flow. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia, for that. I will quickly check with Sina and Socio whether they want to add something before we give a chance to the audience. There's a question from the audience.
Yeah, so coming back to looking at if it's a challenge or if we can find a way forward for this. Coming from the academic side, I personally, for me, I tried as much as I can when I do papers and research to have like our panelists have mentioned, you have, because for me, I look more into climate and food security. So I tried as much as I can to ensure that even if I have these Western names, the names that were given, I tried also to make sure that the local names of or the different foods that is there to be mentioned in the papers, because one of the ways in which our language can be put forward to the public and it can be used for policies, because when it comes to publication, this is also the space where a lot of the informations that people can have access to and understand what is going on within our region is through our papers and through our work. So for me personally, when I do a paper, I tried as much as I can to also make sure that I have the local names of whatever foods that I am looking at or that I am writing about. So this is also one way it's more like educating people from outside to also understand that, yes, we also have our own traditional languages for these certain food groups. So I think that is also one of the things that I would also like to mention when it comes to how we can make sure that our language has also been heard. Thank you.
Thanks, Tina, for that. Susio?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Malaina. I think just a quick comment, there's definitely an evolution in these spaces. I think I'll stick strictly just to the legal side of it. With regards to international law, there's a clear evolution in terms of how it's practiced, how it's perceived, and it is, I think, high time, especially from the Pacific, or not just the Pacific, but from Global South communities as well, to start dictating how they are perceived in these multilateral spaces, how they're perceived internationally. Setting standards for themselves, essentially. And that includes dictating terminology or dictating the interpretation of certain legal elements. I think one of the most, a clear example is in Latin America, they have a very well fleshed out legal regime around the rights of nature, but that's taken from an indigenous perspective. And that's essentially rooting Western concepts such as intergenerational equity, but viewing it from an indigenous lens, the rights of nature and the belongings that you leave behind for future generations. So examples like that, where you root your understanding and your interpretation of concepts in your own practice, in your cultural practices, essentially is the practice of setting your own standards. I think another really clear example that we've observed as PSFCC is that the use of something as simple as small island developing states, and that was that simple push not too long ago for large ocean states. It's just an example. But the use of large ocean states and that subtle push from the Pacific was to not necessarily an act of wordplay, but an act of decolonialism, and not just in terms of these systems that we operate under, but ways of thinking as well. So I like to name ourselves or to dictate how we are perceived is to reject our vulnerability. It's imposed by systems that we didn't dictate ourselves. And then our vulnerability is not necessarily natural. It isn't natural, right? It's created, and that's from decades of extraction or militarization, emissions dumped into our regions. And when global frameworks reduce these experiences or these peoples or these persons into acronyms like SIDS or PSIDS, it becomes, it may be a bit radical, but an act of erasure, right? Essentially, it becomes that drama. It sounds dramatic because it is dramatized in that way. But when we speak our truths in our language, especially in multilateral spaces, the use of words as simple as talano, as vanua, as moana, you essentially recenter your power as the Pacific, or you recenter your power as Global South. And I want to just bring that up there. There's just these small examples. Pass it back there, so there's time for people to ask questions. Thank you.
Thanks, panelists, for all of that contribution. I'm conscious of our audience, and I'm just wondering whether is there anyone who wants to pose a question to the panel as a group or individually, and give you a chance to do that. We haven't finished though, but we still have some question or two to get to the panelists, but conscious of the audience. If there's none, that's okay. We can go to the last leg of our panel. This is again an open question, and I'm just wondering in terms of, now that we have a document, now we have an agreement in all those, in the COP29, for example, there was always an output, an agreement that being popped out of each meeting, and I'm just wondering in terms of to what extent do we have we're able, one, to translate that to a language that can be understood in our community. Two, if there is a need to make amendments to some of those documents, to what extent do we have an input from the Pacific? Now, let me ask again. I'm making reference now to policy that, agreement that comes out of, say, COP29, for example. And, as in any COP, there's an output, there's an agreement. To what extent do we have, when I say we're talking about Pacific delegation, Pacific region as PC as a group, that we can influence or translate the output. If there's a need to make any amendments, first. The second, when we finally get the final output, how do we take that and inform our communities and tell our community these are the things that came out of, we've now agreed to for the next year. Any thoughts on that? Have you experienced that before in that space, or it never happened, or something that might probably start thinking of upping our intervention in terms of the global negotiations? I'm asking no one in particular.
Yeah.
This is an open forum.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello? Yes. I'm so sorry, Tolu. I'm now on the road, so I can't turn on the video, but I can sort of give some reflection there while on the topic. So what the research has found, and not only my research, but other who have undertaken sort of ethnography, but also following Pacific negotiations, how we've been able to influence these through the language. And one particular area that we've been very successful in is coming together as a group to create a narrative. And that one of those early narratives was what we call frontline states, Pacific Island countries at the frontline states, and the need for special consideration. Now, by creating that narrative that we are vulnerable at the front line, what authors have argued that this has created our strategy of agenda setting. Because of this, the world gives attention or gives the first pronouns to Pacific Island states to sort of set the agenda. So that's one way in which to influence that as frontline states, we need special consideration. Now, this term of special consideration was also given in the making of the Rio Convention back in 1990s, and has given us that sort of special seat at the table. And this is not only for climate change, but also within the certification, but also within the Biodiversity Convention. The term special consideration means Pacific Island states or SID states will have special means of implementation. So an example of this, while there are 10 seats globally for vice president of the COP Bureau, they've created a special consideration, an 11th seat, and that seat has always been a Pacific Island. So we have been able to influence negotiations at a very strategic level, being the 11th seat. And it's the only seat that's available within the UN system under the UNFCCC, and it's always held by a Pacific Islander. So that's one strategy in these terms. But beyond, the research has also, especially with what we've been following, is that Pacific Islanders are now more strategic, not just at the beginning, at agenda setting, but now at the conclusion. And this has also come through from policy. So one of those work that we've worked very closely with, not only through SPRIP, but also what's known as a One Crop, the Council of Regional Organizations program. We've created avenues in which Pacific people are there at the end of negotiations to give those powerful, emotive speeches. We've seen that in the work of Ngaluman Mana and Rasmussen, the current lead negotiator for AOSIS, who was able to give a damning speech towards Dubai, that a decision was made without Pacific Islanders in the room. And that gave sort of an emotional outcry at the disappointment and how Pacific Island countries and leaders did not see favorable negotiations from this end. So that gave a lot of news around the world, but also elevated that the Pacific were not happy with this engagement. But being strategic in these end parts of negotiations is not just having your lead negotiators there, but also your ministers. So part of policy that came out of it is what we now know as the political champions. These are the 7 ministers. And there's strategic work that we all undertake as researchers and as CROP, but also national countries, to ensure that these ministers are there at the end. Because there are times when the negotiations get to a point that only ministers can enter the room and make final decisions. And so we've created these strategies to ensure that we do have ministers there at the final end who can speak, who know the jargon, but can also speak to international media. This is all part of this communications program and planning that comes in the work of negotiations. And these are just examples of not just how the research informs strategy, but the effectiveness of Pacific Island leaders and peoples in COP negotiations. Thank you.
Thanks, George, for that intervention. I'm just checking with the rest of the panel whether they have any sort of like last closing comments on that question, and also reflect on some of the things that George had mentioned.
Sorry to interrupt. I thought Patricia had a video to share with us, so could be an opportune time to do that, Patricia.
Yes, I could. However, I saw Ariella. I think she raised her hand. I'm not sure if you want to take questions now.
Yes, we are open for questions.
So if you'd like, while we open the floor for questions, I'll just share one of the graphics just to allow, because there's a couple of videos, but I'm not going to show all of them, but I just wanted to share this if people wanted to just save or do like scan the QR code, because this is a whole playlist that has the videos that you're able to watch. All right, so if you'd like, I'm going to just share one of the videos. If you want to watch the other ones, I'm open to sharing that as well, but I don't want to take up all the time that we have. I'd rather get some questions.
Dr. Tolu, I think we are ready for one video, I guess.
Okay,
do-
okay,
I'll
that's
leave
fine.
it to you. I'll leave it to
No,
everybody
no,
else.
no, that's fine. We can show the video. Thanks.
Okay, yep, that's just one of the videos, and because they're meant for deaf people, there is no audio.
Thanks, Patricia, for the video. It's an opportunity for us to learn the sign language too.
Well, from
Final comment.
attending the different COPs in all the different countries, I sometimes struggle because the language, I don't know all of the languages. So I learned that, just sign in general, you go to any country in the world, everybody understands sign language. There's just this universal ability to express yourself using your face and your hands and things, and people get it. So I think everyone should learn sign.
What an ending to an interesting panel. At the end of the day, and I think sign language is perhaps one of the ways in which we can also communicate and make an influence at that global space that we've been hearing from our panels. At this point, I would like to thank our panel for sharing with us their experiences. I know there's much that we can talk about, and I hope that this will be extended to the next session, as Vajen mentioned that there's one in May. I would like to see, and I hope to see some of the panelists joining us then, or by an invitation that they will join us then. But thank you very much, George, Patricia, Cecilia, and Sina. I know Carl would have loved to be here, but for unknown reason. But thank you very much for your contribution. I'm sure there is, there's more that we can contribute to this space. I'd also like to thank the organizers for this event, colleagues at the linguistic and language section of USP, Fiona and Rajen, but also Dr. Mila Ba'a for organizing this space for all of us and for, again, our audience. Although you may not have participated in this session, but we're hoping that our session next month that you will join us and also extend or or talk a little bit more about some of the things that came up in today's webinar. But from me, that's it from me. I'll pass it to Rajan in case there are some other things that we need to mention before we close. But thanks once again for allowing me to moderate. It's not an easy job, but we try what we can. But thanks. Over to you, Rajan.
Thank you. I think the only person left to really who deserves our thanks is Dr. Mulia Ina. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to moderate. And I think you were the best person to do this. And of course, thanks to all the panelists and all the participants. And our next series of conference, the next one will be on 21st May. And it is about language matters in environmental conservation. So it's actually a continuation of this. And I hope to see some of our panelists. They might want to join and say, oh, we need to tell us more about things. And of course, to our students who joined and all colleagues, thanks a lot. See you in the next conference. Vinaka.